Canada is a warning to the rest of the world. So he did a video about the UK with basically the same title, the UK warning the rest of the world. There was a lot of crossover between the UK economy and but I think he's going to specifically address the Canadian economy. So let's have a
Ago, I
listen.
made a video called The UK is a Warning to the Rest of the World. It was about the entirely avoidable economic stagnation that overtook what was once the world's preeminent industrial power. The comment section of that video was unusually lively, but some comments really stood out. A lot of my viewers were saying some version of just change the name of the country and you've basically described Canada. They said this, it should be noted, very politely. So today, let's talk about Canada. Now, back in 2012, a comparison like that would have seemed absurd. At that point, the global consensus on Canada was that it was the ultimate best of all worlds economy. It had the natural resources of a Gulf state, the social safety net of a Northern European country, and a housing market that only seemed to move in one direction. Canada is a country that on paper should be one of the wealthiest nations on earth. It has the second largest landmass in the world. It holds
Nickel, cobalt, aluminum, copper, tungsten. And you know that, like, look at how many dots are near the bottom. It's guaranteed that that's the place that we inspected the most. So you can imagine that there's more up here. It's just you got to go out there and do searching. Copper. Look at it all. Smelter, refinery, mine, advanced project.
the third largest proven oil reserves. It's fifth in natural gas. It has an abundance of uranium, potash, rare earth minerals, and fresh water. It has a highly educated population, a stable democracy, rule of law, and G7 membership. By every measure of endowment, Canada should be a superpower. In fact, there was a brief window in 2012 where the median Canadian household actually pulled ahead of its American counterpart, becoming, by several measures, the most affluent middle class in the world. Looking
2012.
back from 2026, it's clear that this outperformance was driven by a unique set of circumstances. It was the height of a global commodity boom where crude oil prices had nearly quadrupled over a decade, and the Canadian dollar was trading at or above parity with the US dollar. While high energy prices were a headwind for the US, they were a massive tailwind for Canada. But if you look at the data today, that era of outperformance has vanished. The decline isn't marked by a sudden collapse or a dramatic crisis. It's a slow but always polite stagnation. Between 2012 and today, Canada has fallen from number 6 on the World Happiness Index to number 25.
So we looked at this and specifically youth unhappiness, so under the age of 25 in Canada, ranked 71st out of like 150 countries. And this is a country that used to be like 5 or 6 or 4 consistently. And now generally we're 25. And if you look at the youth, it is abysmal. They are not managing it well.
Its lowest ranking since the survey began. To see a national mood sour this quickly, you usually have to look at countries whose central banks have been replaced by printing presses or whose borders are being redrawn. In Canada, the institutions are still there and the borders haven't moved. It's just that the arithmetic of a middle class life has slowly stopped balancing. National income per head has fallen from roughly 80% of the American level in the decade before the pandemic to around 70%.
Purchasing power. Let me make sense of this here. Moose Trap. Canada GDP per person at purchasing power parity relative to the United States. So 2000, we're at like 85. Stuck around 85. 2012, 2013 started pretty sharp decline. That's 24. So this is pretty old because we're up to 26 now. I wonder it went. I mean, that's not the way you want your line going. It's not.
Today. If Canadian provinces were American states, Alberta, the oil rich outlier, would rank around 20th wealthiest, somewhere between Colorado and Tennessee. Ontario, Canada's most populous and economically central province, would rank 48, below Montana, below Alabama, and below every southern state except Mississippi. New Brunswick would rank dead last, below Mississippi. The provinces that contain most of Canada's population sit near the bottom of the combined list. A country that was briefly richer per capita than the United States is now having a serious debate about whether it can arrest a generational decline. The British disease that I described last month was an object lesson in compounding errors, but Canada's version of this stagnation is unique. It's a story of how a country with every possible advantage managed to fall into what Bank of Canada Senior Deputy Governor Caroline Rogers called, in a 2024 speech, a productivity emergency.
I think one of the big drivers of this our visa work program. Bring in cheaper labor to do jobs, and it prevents, like, if you didn't have cheap labor to do the job, you would need to increase the productivity of the people paying. And therefore, when there isn't cheap labor, there has to be a productivity in order to make workers globally competitive. And so if you just bring in cheap labor, you don't see the productivity because they're not needed, and now you have a productivity emergency throughout the country. So they've done this to themselves. We've done this to ourselves.
The reason I think the rest of the world should pay attention to Canada is not that Canada is failing spectacularly. It is failing gradually, systematically, and in ways that are entirely legible, compounding errors that
and fixable. All of the problems that are leading Canada down this path can be fixed. You just need someone with the will to do it in office.
Reinforce each other, each one individually defensible, collectively ruinous. The same patterns are visible in countries across the developed world. Canada just got there first. So let's go through them. But before we do, let me tell you about this week's video sponsor, GenSpark AI. You've already loved GenSpark 2.0 with Super Agent, AI Office Suite, and AI Media Agents. But now it's evolved into GenSpark 3.0, your ultimate all-in-one AI workspace. It comes with 3 game-changing features you won't want to miss. First, GenSpark Claw and Cloud Computer, your dedicated AI employee. Every user gets a private, always-on cloud computer, so your data is 100% secure and isolated. MessageClaw on WhatsApp, Telegram, Slack, and Teams. It handles research, drafts, emails, even calls, and delivers finished work straight to you. Second, GenSpark workflows. Automate busy work across more than 20 apps, including Google Suite, Notion, and Salesforce. Use pre-built templates or create custom pipelines with no more repetitive tasks. Third, GenSpark Teams, a free built-in team hub with real-time chat, co-editing, shared projects, docs, slides, design, video, all in one place. GenSpark's growth speaks for itself. They went from concept to $200 million in annual revenue in just 11 months. Right now, new users get free credits to try premium features when they sign up. And for all of 2026, AI Chat and AI Image are completely unlimited for paid users. Head to genspark.ai using the link in the video description to give it a go. Consider a thought experiment. Imagine a professional sports league where the same 3 or 4 teams win every year. They have the largest stadiums, the biggest TV deals, and the most expensive players. The other teams are technically allowed to compete, but the rules of the game have been structured over the decades to make it very difficult for anyone new to enter. What tends to happen over time is not just that the incumbents win, it's that the whole quality of play declines. Without genuine competitive pressure, there's no incentive to innovate, to take risks, or to improve. Canada's domestic economy has, in several of its most important sectors, been running this kind of league for 30 years. Take telecommunications. Canada has 3 dominant carriers, Bell, Rogers, and TELUS, who collectively hold roughly 89% of wireless subscribers. Canada has, as a result,
Really, that many? Just the 3 of them? Not gonna show it again.
years. Take telecommunications. Canada has 3 dominant carriers, Bell, Rogers, and TELUS, who collectively hold roughly 89% of wireless subscribers. Canada
Only leaves 11% elsewhere. What?
has, as a result, some of the highest mobile phone bills in the developed world. A comparable unlimited data plan costs roughly twice as much in Canada as in the UK or France. The Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, or the CRTC, which is what you'd call it if you'd like to get home before midnight, has for years been theoretically open to new entrants. But the practical and regulatory barriers have ensured that meaningful competition never quite materialized. The industry has spent lavishly on lobbying and regulatory intervention. It spent rather less on network investment per customer than its counterparts in more competitive markets. Banking tells a similar story. 5 Canadian banks, the Royal Bank, TD, Scotiabank, BMO, and CIBC, hold approximately 90% of deposits in the country. The Canadian banking system is, by design, highly stable. It didn't have a financial crisis in 2008, unlike most of the developed world. This is a genuine achievement, and Canadian bankers will remind you of it at every available opportunity. But stability and dynamism are not the same thing. A concentrated banking sector allocates capital conservatively. It lends to proven assets, existing real estate, established corporations, rather than to new ventures. The startup ecosystem that Canada has quietly built, particularly in AI, has often found that the most growth-oriented capital came from American funds, not from Bay Street. The pattern repeats in airlines, in groceries, and in broadcasting. A small number of large incumbents protected by ownership restrictions, regulatory capture, or both extract returns from a captive domestic market. The economist's term for this is rent seeking. The polite Canadian term is a stable industry. The consequence is that Canada's labour productivity, the output generated per hour worked, has declined relative to American productivity over time. In 1997, the productivity gap was narrower. Since
Oh, he's got a chart for it. Beautiful. Comparing Canada and the United States, assessments of Canada economic performance relative to the United States over the last 3 decades on measure used. Okay, what are our 3 lines? We have real GDP per capita, real GNI per capita, labor productivity. So if you look back, our labor productivity was on par at 100% pretty much of US productivity. Because this is economic performance relative to the United States. I'm going to say that this is like 100%, and then it's just continued to decline. We're at like 75% productivity. Like, you need a massive investment to fix that.
Then the two economies have diverged by a cumulative 26 percentage points. Canada has not become less productive in absolute terms, it simply failed to keep pace with an economy where competitive pressure is significantly higher and where venture capital has directed hundreds of billions of dollars into the highest productivity sectors of the global economy. Canada spends less than half the OECD average on research and development as a share of GDP, a figure that has been below the average for 2 decades running. There's also the question of internal trade. Canada,
like, R&D is how you build the future. If you're spending less on it, we're going to see declines in the future. It's pretty straightforward. There is a direct relationship between these two.
has a free trade agreement with the United States, Mexico, the European Union, and most of Asia Pacific. It does not have a fully functioning free trade agreement with itself, a structural curiosity that has persisted in various forms since Confederation. In January 2005, the average Canadian home sold for 237,000 Canadian dollars. By early 2026, the average had reached $661,000.
Holy. That's wild. So in 2000, the average price pretty much all across Canada was like $100,000. 26 years. Places where that's 5x. Vancouver. Hearing about how bad Vancouver, Toronto are. And you look at like something like Edmonton, and yes, there is this huge spike. And then it pretty much stayed the same with a very slight incline. Calgary's Ottawa, look at that. Just that's crazy.
A nominal increase of around 179%, or nearly tripling in price. Even adjusted for inflation, the gain is still huge. In the country's largest cities, it's been transformational. Now, there's a common comparison made in conversations about Canadian housing that homes have outperformed the stock market over time. It's worth pausing on this. On a straight price appreciation basis, the TSX Composite Index actually outperformed Canadian housing over the same period, and substantially so once dividends are reinvested.
So the housing market did not outperform the stock market.
The point is not, therefore, that housing beat stocks. The point is that housing performed like an equity investment in a non productive asset. A company, when it rises in value, has generally done so by producing something, a product, a service, a patent, a drug, a piece of software. The stock price reflects real economic activity, real production. A house, when it rises in value, has generally done so because land in a desirable location has become scarcer, because planning restrictions have constrained supply, or because a decade of historically low interest rates created a wall of capital seeking somewhere to go. The house didn't invent anything, it didn't employ a research team, it just sat there. This distinction matters because of leverage. If you bought a Toronto home in 2005 for $300,000 with a 20% deposit, so $60,000 down, and that home is now worth around $900,000, your original $60,000 has generated a capital gain of $600,000.
Yeah, but how do I? Toronto real estate market chart. See if we can find. Great image. I think we're gonna need to find an actual website. The full report. Nope. That is here we go. This is the chart I like. So these are the different prices of homes in Toronto. Here's their average price. See, like if you bought, they're all going down. The whole buy a house and then you make capital gains on that house is not what is happening right. When you buy a house now, you gotta factor in how much you're gonna lose on that investment. I mean, that's great. Where was the
That is a 10 to 1 return on the actual cash invested. It's also, in Canada, entirely tax free if it was your primary residence. If you had instead taken that same $60,000 and put it into a TSX index fund, it would be worth roughly $195,000 today. A solid result, but it gets diluted because of capital gains tax on the profit. The incentive structure this creates is problematic. The rational economic choice for a Canadian household with savings has been for 20 years to put as much money as possible into real estate as early as possible at as high a leverage ratio as your bank will allow. This is not irrational behavior, it's an entirely logical response to the incentives that the system created.
the incentives that they had created in here that was working pretty much this whole period of time until about middle of 2022. And now that is no longer working.
It is, after all, how everyone you know made most of their money. The consequences of this are considerable. Housing prices in Canada's major cities now sit at somewhere between 12 and 17 times median household income. The median after tax income for a Canadian individual in 2023 was $74,000 a year. At the national average price of $661,000, the price to income ratio is approximately 9. In Toronto and Vancouver, it's substantially higher.
Price to income ratio. That is how many years, if you put your full amount of income towards your housing, take to pay off housing. What is the price to income ratio in Canada's largest cities? Can you explain price to income ratio as well? All right, let's have a look. Price to income ratio, no. Also called the house price to income ratio or median multiple, measures housing affordability. It divides the median home price in an area by the median and household income. A ratio of 3 or below is generally considered affordable. Ratios between 3.1 and 5 are moderately affordable. 5.1 to 9, severely unaffordable. And above 9 is extremely or impossibly unaffordable in many analyses. Okay, let's go. We got our numbers. Here are our approximate price to income ratios for Canada's largest metropolitan areas. Vancouver, 11.4 to 13.5. So 9 is extremely unaffordable. They're just running it up, huh? Like, how is that sustainable? Oh, I know that's gonna be the worst one, right? Yeah. Toronto, 10.4 to 10.7. Looks low compared to the last one, and it is still extremely unaffordable. Victoria, 9.8. Hamilton, 8.6. Ottawa, 6.5. Is that even in the moderately affordable range? Yeah. So below 9, no. Severely unaffordable. You got to be below 5 before you get moderately affordable. Ottawa's still not there. Calgary's not there. Montreal's not there. Edmonton says it's lower, but number. Other notes, smaller slash prairies slash Quebec cities like Winnipeg, Saskatoon, or Quebec City tend to have ratios closer to 4 to 6, making it relatively more accessible. Context, Canada's overall national ratio has hovered in 7 to 9 range. What? What are they doing? None of this makes sense. Why do you allow homes to become like not only severely unaffordable, extremely or impossibly unaffordable? What's the game plan with this? Because I'll tell you what it's doing. It's making the youth happiness index of our country drop down to 71. Like, this is having horrible effects everywhere. want to aim for a 3 to, you want to blame below 3. Why the ratios matter in broader context. High ratios in Vancouver and Toronto contribute to challenges like delayed home ownership, increased renting, intergenerational wealth gaps, and out migration pressure. So out migration pressures, I assume people leaving. Factors include chronic supply shortages, population growth, investor activity, and geographic/zoning constraint. I remember watching a video, and it was this old guy complaining about the apartment complex that they were trying to build next door, all the problems that the apartment complex would cause, how like gonna affect his sunlight. And I mean, like, the country's having issues, and you care more about how a building will affect your sunlight than fixing systemic issues inside our country. And it's just mind boggling. I really think the federal government should control zoning. Should take it away from the municipalities. Now the federal government gets control of it. Actually work towards fixing this issue. Continue.
In 2020 and 2021, CIBC estimated that roughly one third of first time buyers received a parental gift to fund their down payment. The average amount was 82,000 Canadian dollars, which, as it happens, is slightly more than the median Canadian individual's annual after tax income. In Vancouver, the average parental gift was 180,000 Canadian dollars. In Toronto, it exceeded $130,000. The Bank of Mom and Dad has in certain Canadian cities become the largest mortgage lender in the country. It doesn't, however, publish accounts. Amusingly, in researching this, I found a Canadian real estate industry publication where the author argued that what Canada's housing market needed was further tax relief for property owners on the grounds that this would stimulate more housing transactions. I don't like to beat up on someone, but consider the environment in which it's being made. The average home in Vancouver costs more than 17 times the average income. The suggested solution is to make property ownership even more tax advantaged than it already is. This is a bit like a doctor seeing a patient with high blood pressure and suggesting that they eat more salt. Technically, it will do something, it's just not obvious that the something is helpful. The political economy of this situation is almost perfectly paralysed. Approximately 66% of Canadian households own their own homes, meaning that two-thirds of the electorate have a direct financial stake in keeping house prices high.
We saw this on the happiness index. Those that own homes are actually quite happy. It's just, the 1 in 3 that don't own a home that tend to be the youth that it's becoming exceedingly unaffordable to just live in the country. And see that in the happiness. Canadian youth at 71 is terrifying. I don't see why nobody appears to be trying to fix it. Like, we see them coming down, but at the rate they're falling, it's going to take a long time before you fix the problem. In that time frame, that problem's just going to get worse.
A government that credibly committed to building sufficient new housing to return prices to something resembling affordability would be asking a majority of its voters to accept a substantial reduction in the value of their single largest asset. In Britain, we identified this as the central political obstacle to housing reform. In Canada, the problem is essentially identical. The 2026 World Happiness Report contains a data point that I find genuinely striking. Canada overall ranks 25th, which is a significant fall from 6th a decade ago, but still a respectable position for a country that is, by any objective standard, wealthy, peaceful, and well governed. But when you break this down by age, the
Oh, he's
picture
going to get into
changes
it.
substantially. Canadians over 60 rank in the global top 10 for happiness. Canadians under 25 rank 71st. 71st, below countries with a fraction of Canada's per capita income. That ranking reflects not just where Canada stands, but how fast it has fallen. The World Happiness Report tracks the decline in youth.
Like, this is the future of the country, right? Like, these are the people that are going to grow up and enter the other age group. This is a profound issue that needs to be fixed.
Happiness since 2011 across 136 countries. Of those, only 3 recorded a steeper drop than Canada: Malawi, Lebanon, and Afghanistan. One of the 3
So wait, like 2 of them were active war zones?
has a poverty rate above 70%. One has been in active armed conflict. One is governed by the Taliban. Canada is the 4th. There's a clean explanation for this divergence, and it is the housing market. Older Canadians who bought homes in the 1980s, 1990s, or early 2000s have, through the entirely normal process of sitting in their houses, accumulated wealth that would have been the envy of a successful entrepreneur. The median senior family in Canada holds net assets of approximately 1.1 million Canadian dollars. The median family, where the main earner is under 35, holds approximately $159,000. This is not because young Canadians are less capable, less hardworking, or less disciplined. It's because the asset that generated extraordinary returns for the previous generation is now priced at a level that makes it structurally inaccessible without either a very high income, a parental transfer, or both. Youth unemployment reached 14.7% in late 2025. Approximately 914,000 young Canadians, just under a million, were classified as NEET, not in employment, education, or training. This is the mechanism of generational wealth transfer that the housing market has created. It's not a conspiracy. Nobody designed it this way. It's simply the predictable outcome of a set of policies, planning restrictions, tax treatment of primary residents, mortgage incentives, and low interest rates that happen to be extremely good for people who owned assets 25 years ago and are considerably less good for people trying to acquire assets today. It also, incidentally, explains why the country's most talented young people increasingly look south. Which brings me briefly to Elon Musk. Elon Musk was born in South Africa. At 17, he moved to Canada, where he held citizenship through his mother, and stayed for approximately 2 years before relocating to the United States. He's now variously the world's richest person, the owner of Twitter, which he acquired for $44 billion and renamed X, and a figure of considerable political controversy in the country that eventually kept him. I bring him up not as evidence of Canada's loss, but because of the underlying pattern. Talented individual arrives in Canada, acquires residency, departs for the United States for better economic opportunities. There's nothing really unusual about this story. It is, in fact, the dominant finding of a July 2025 Statistics Canada study on skilled emigration. The study found that roughly 22,000 to 35,000 Canadians move to the United States each year. More striking, about 60% of those applying for US work authorization from Canada are not Canadian born at all. They're skilled immigrants who came to Canada first.
So people move to Canada and then go to the US because once you have a Canadian citizen, it's easier to transfer to the US, I'm guessing, because there's better economic opportunities. That's
First
rough.
and subsequently moved on. The median US salary offer for these individuals was $137,000, primarily in computer, mathematical, and engineering fields. Canada attracted them, educated them in some cases, and then lost them to a market that paid more and taxed less. The Conference Board has called this the leaky bucket problem. Canada has one of the world's most generous immigration systems. It brings in large numbers of highly educated people, but 1 in 5 skilled immigrants leaves within 25 years, with the highest attrition in the first 5 years, precisely when they're the most economically mobile and most likely to be comparing their Canadian prospects to their alternatives. Canada is not, on this evidence, suffering from a brain drain in the classic sense. It's functioning as a very efficient talent incubator for the United States economy, which is a service, I suppose, just not one that Canada intended to provide. Since 1997, Canadian labour productivity has fallen progressively behind that of the United States. The cumulative gap is now approximately 26 percentage points. To put that in terms that I think are more intuitive, for every dollar of output generated by an American worker in an hour, a Canadian worker generates roughly 74 cents. This is not a story about working less. Hours worked per Canadian are broadly comparable to those in the United States. It's a story about where those hours have been directed. The economy has channeled its investment, human, financial, and physical, into sectors that produce lower output per unit of effort. Real estate, public administration, retail, and a financial sector that lends against bricks rather than ideas.
Canada trails the US in labor productivity across nearly all sectors, but momentum is building in a select few. Canada productivity levels relative to the US, outperforming or outpacing agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting. Falling further behind construction, wholesale trade, real estate and rental and leasing, arts, entertainment and recreation, utilities, mining, quarry, oil and gas extraction, information and cultural industries. Okay, there's a couple things we're catching up on. Manufacture, other services, except public administration, finance and insurance, transportation and warehousing. I mean, there's a lot more in the falling further behind category. And if those dots are the scale of the industries, that's not good.
Canada's business investment in research and development as a share of GDP has been below the OECD average for 20 consecutive years. The gap between Canadian and American R&D spending per capita is large and widening. A country that doesn't invest in the production of new knowledge or new processes eventually finds that its work.
I love these charts. Canada has low investment levels for a nation of its size. Okay, we're going to be on here. There we are. Total land area. I mean, look at the population rather than land area. People are what makes money. Gross fixed capital formation. Total land area. Is that correct? Like, I know Russia's the biggest, but I thought Canada was the second largest country. This makes it look like both China and the US have a larger land mass. So I instantly don't trust this chart. How does Canada, the US, and China's land mass compare in size? Like, maybe we're all really, really close. Oh, more charts. Love charts. Okay. Countries, total area, land plus inland water. Land area only. So when we look at your land area, water, so those are like rivers and lakes. I mean, we got a lot of lakes in Canada. Probably take total area because are part of it. But if you look at land area only, both China and the United States have a greater land area than Canada. We're all really close, no matter how you look at it. Even. Okay, so then if you look at land area only, this chart makes sense. Brazil, who's that other dot up there? Yeah.
Because they're doing the same things in the same ways as a generation ago, which is roughly what has happened. There is a further structural point worth making about the composition of the workforce. Between 2015 and 2025, public sector employment in Canada grew by approximately 30%. I'm not arguing that public servants don't provide valuable services. Many of them do. It's just worth noting that a growing share of the highest security employment in Canada is in sectors that do not, by definition, produce exportable goods or generate productivity growth in the conventional sense. The Bank of Canada's most recent forecast for real economic growth is 1.25% annually. For an economy with Canada's endowments, that is unimpressive. Approximately 75% of Canada's exports go to the United States. For reference, total
That's changed a lot recently. What percentage of Canadian exports currently go to the United States? Like, the tariff has caused a pretty sharp decline. Or not. As of the most recent year data, approximately 71.7 to 72% of Canada's merchandise exports went to the United States. This represents a notable decline from 75.9. I mean, not really notable. A couple percentage points. I guess the tariffs aren't having that big of an effect.
merchandise exports to the US represent roughly one third of Canadian GDP. No other developed economy is so comprehensively tethered to a single trading partner. This concentration was, for a very long time, a reasonable arrangement. The United States was a stable, rules-based market. The two countries shared a border, a language, a legal tradition, and a broadly aligned foreign policy. NAFTA and later the USMCA provided a framework of predictability. Canadian businesses rationally chose not to spend money developing Asian or European market access when the American market was so large, so close, and so accessible. The problem with
It just made more sense to build for the Americans. And now that tariffs have come up, you see Carney struggling to create new trade deals, to diversify trade.
concentrating your economic exposure to a single counterparty is that you're entirely dependent on that counterparty's goodwill and continuity of policy. Recent events have illustrated this risk with some emphasis. Nowhere is Canada's strategic exposure more visible than in energy. Canada holds the world's third largest proven oil reserves, the vast majority in the Alberta oil sands. The United States is the overwhelmingly dominant customer. Because Canada has historically lacked sufficient tidewater export infrastructure to access Asian or European markets, it has sold oil at a consistent discount to the global benchmark price. WCS is a heavy sour crude, more expensive to refine than the lighter American benchmark, and some discount is structurally warranted. But the historical gap of $15 to $20 per barrel was consistently larger than the quality differential alone would justify. The excess reflects a transportation premium that accrued not to Canada but to the American Midwest refiners, who, for decades, were the only buyers with ready access. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion entered commercial service in May 2024. It added approximately 590,000 barrels per day of capacity, bringing total Trans Mountain capacity to around 890,000 barrels per day. The WCS WTI discount has narrowed since then, from roughly $19.82.
So as soon as you're able to get your oil out to another market, the discount narrows.
To around $12.52 per barrel. This is progress. The pipeline cost approximately 34 billion Canadian dollars to build, against an original 2012 estimate of 5.4 billion Canadian dollars. That is a cost overrun of roughly 530%. It remains one of the more spectacular infrastructure project management failures in recent Canadian history. But it is built and it is moving oil to tidewater. The more interesting counterfactual is Energy East. Energy East was a proposed 4,600 kilometer pipeline that would have carried 1.1 million barrels per day from Alberta to St. John, New Brunswick. The Canaport terminal at St. John had already received 300 million Canadian dollars in upgrades and can accommodate supertankers, much larger vessels than those serviced by the Vancouver terminus. Energy East would have opened Atlantic and European markets in addition to Asian ones. It was cancelled in October 2017 following years of regulatory review, shifting political winds, and organised opposition. Several Canadians I spoke to in researching this video described the cancellation as the single most consequential strategic error in recent Canadian economic history. Canada also has internal trade barriers that function, according to the IMF, like a 6.9% tariff on domestic commerce. A wine producer in British Columbia cannot easily sell to a restaurant in Ontario. A construction worker licensed in Alberta may need to re-qualify to work in Quebec. A medical device cleared in one province requires reapproval in another. Eliminating these barriers, which has the support of 95% of Canadians, according to polling by Angus Reid, could, according to various estimates, add between 90 billion and 200 billion per year to GDP. This has been known for decades, but the
That
barriers
would just be
remain.
good.
On the topic of trade balance,
I'm pretty sure we've looked into that, the intra-trade barrier system in Canada. Um, the last estimate I seen was actually higher, stating a 9% tariff trading between provinces, like unseen. And obviously, it depends on the good, but some goods are tariff more or tariff less. It's not a tariff. It's non-tax trade barrier that exists between the provinces. From my understanding, they are trying to remove largely. How's that going? I hear that Canada is trying to remove interprovincial trade barriers. How is that going currently? Let's see. Canada has accelerated efforts to reduce interprovincial trade barriers since mid 2025, driven by economic pressures and a push to build a more unified One Canada economy. Progress has been notable at the federal level through new agreements, but experts and business groups describe it as incremental rather than transformative. The real heavy lifting remains with provinces and territories. Many regulatory, occupation licensing, and sector specific barriers persist. They're taking tiny steps. In summary, Canada has made meaningful progress on paper and at the federal level since 2025, with new rules now in effect or rolling out in 2026. However, the process is ongoing and incomplete. Full realization of economic upside requires sustained provincial cooperation and detailed follow through. Business and economist feedback suggests optimism tempered by the need for faster, more comprehensive action beyond initial agreements. So they're making some progress, but it sounds like it's at the provincial level now, where a lot of regulations are affecting.
Canada runs a goods trade surplus with the United States, but it runs an overall current account deficit when you include services and investment income. This distinction matters because Canada is sometimes characterized in trade discussions as a surplus economy in the Chinese mold. This is not accurate. Canada runs structural deficits in services, in tourism, in intellectual property, in financial services that offset its goods surplus. Canada is, in aggregate, a net importer. It is not a mercantilist economy systematically accumulating foreign reserves at the expense of its trading partners. It's a country that sells raw materials and manufactures less than it buys. I've spent the better part of this video cataloging what's gone wrong. In the interest of intellectual honesty, I should spend some time on what is not. The FT's Tej Parikh, in two pieces that I would recommend to anyone thinking seriously about Canada's economic position, makes a point that I think is underappreciated. Canada's endowments are extraordinary. It has the resources, the institutions, the human capital, and the geographic position to be not merely a well functioning mid sized economy, but as Parikh puts it, a genuine economic superpower. Canada's endowments, as I described at the outset, are extraordinary, the kind that most countries would consider a permanent structural advantage. What's less well understood is the institutional capital that sits alongside them. The Maple 8, Canada's 8 largest pension funds, collectively manage around 1.6 trillion Canadian dollars in assets. They are amongst the most sophisticated institutional investors in the world. If structured as a sovereign wealth fund, they would be the third largest in the world. Canada's university system produces, by international standards, excellent graduates. A 2025 survey suggested that approximately 17 million university educated people globally would choose to move to Canada if they could. Canada's AI research ecosystem, centered on Montreal, Toronto, and the Vector Institute, is genuinely world class. Geoffrey Hinton, Yoshua Bengio, and Richard Sutton, three of the most consequential figures in the development of modern AI, all did their foundational work in Canada. The
Really?
country has something real to build on. Canada also holds the G7's lowest net debt to GDP ratio, and
What? Canada's national debt is one of the lowest in the G7. Net national debt, percent of G. What's the difference of net national debt? Because when I looked at this, we were at like 110, and this is showing us way down. What is Canada's net debt to GDP ratio? And what is the difference between the debt to GDP ratio and the net debt to GDP ratio? Okay, let's wait for it to pull down and then Canada's net debt to GDP ratio is a key fiscal metric that measures the government's financial position relative to the size of the economy. As of the most recent official data from Canada, general government's net debt to GDP ratio 44.6%. This was virtually unchanged from 44.7% a year earlier. General government net debt to GDP much lower at around 15.5% at the 2025. Okay. Difference between debt to GDP ratio and net debt. Debt to GDP ratio. This is the total outstanding liabilities, debts, bonds, loans, etc., of the government divided by the country's annual gross domestic product, expressed as a percentage. It shows the raw size of the debt burden relative to economic output. Gross debt includes all obligations without offsetting any government holdings. Higher ratios can signal greater repayment pressure, especially if interest rates rise, though they do not account for what the government owns. Net debt to GDP ratio. This subtracts the government's financial assets from gross debt before dividing by the GDP. Financial assets typically include cash, cash equivalents, investment, receivables, foreign exchange reserve, and stakes in crown corporations or pension funds. So this is a better metric then. Net debt provides a clearer picture of the government's true fiscal position. Okay. I like the looks of that. We get a chart for this. I mean, this is one candidate actually. Ooh, that's low. Doing. I think we'll use just his. Canada G7 average is the solid line. Don't know what the other ones are, but that's pretty good.
deficit as a share of the economy. Its fiscal position is, relative to peers, a genuine strength, which means that it has the capacity to invest if it chooses to. The question is whether external pressure might finally produce the internal reforms that domestic politics have persistently failed to deliver. There is some reason to think that it might. The trade tensions of recent years have created in Canada a political consensus around economic self sufficiency that was absent for most of the last 3 decades. The internal trade barrier discussion, which has been a polite academic conversation for decades, suddenly became urgent. The pipeline question acquired new political salience. Parik's phrase that Canada has spent too long being a client state and branch plant economy of the United States, which would have been controversial to say even 5 years ago, is now being quoted in the House of Commons. The case for optimism, then, is not that Canada will automatically get better. It's that the conditions that might force it to try, external shock, generational transfer of political power, a recognition that the status quo is no longer sustainable, are,
I mean, look at the Canadian Youth Happiness Index. Current conditions are not sustainable in any way.
for the first time in a generation, in place simultaneously. Crises, as it turns out, are occasionally useful. If you found this interesting, you should watch my video on the UK next. The structural parallels.
I watched that one earlier. So, Canada definitely has a set of problems. I didn't know about that whole net debt chart. So this is debt once you account for assets that the government. And so Canada actually has a low debt. I mean, that's good. There's some kind of sovereign debt crisis that happened. That means we're in a much better position. I was hearing all about like the increase in deficit spending. I've heard a lot about Mark Carney's increase to deficit spending. How does this affect the net debt to GDP? Because, like, you spend a lot of money, you spend it on an asset that is acquiring a mine or something, asset that's worth more than the money you put into it, then spending money through the net debt to GDP. If the money was spent in the acquisition of like a good asset. Comes up here Canada's net debt to GDP ratio. Oh, oh, I was really thinking about this one. This first federal budget marked a clear shift towards higher deficit spending, often described as an investment budget to counter U.S. tariffs, boosting defense, infrastructure, housing, and productivity. The budget more than doubled the projected 2025-2026 deficit to 78.3 billion, up from the prior fall economic statements of 36 to 42 billion forecasted under the previous administration. Deficits are then projected to decline gradually, reaching 1.5% of GDP by the end of the horizon. How this affects the net debt to GDP. Total liabilities, net debt equals gross debt minus financial assets. Net debt then is then divided by GDP. Direct mechanisms affecting higher deficit. Deficits require borrowing, gross debt rises unless offset by new financial assets. Net debt also rises. The larger the deficit relative to GDP growth, the higher the net debt to GDP ratio. What the budget actually projects: federal debt to GDP ratio rises modestly 41.2% to 42.4%, peaks at 43.3%, then eases slightly to 43.1%. Net debt itself grows. Government no longer projects a steady decline debt to GDP path over term. Instead, it stabilizes around 43%. They are shifting spending from day-to-day operations to capital investment. Capital spending builds assets, so it increases both debt and assets, limiting the net debt rise. By 2028-2029, the entire deficit is projected to fund growth-oriented investments. They aim to balance the operating budget by 2028-29 via 60 billion in efficiency spending. Project these investments will crowd in 500 million to 1 trillion in private capital, in GDP growth. Critics' view: deficits and spending are higher than ever, than even the prior Trudeau plan. This accelerates debt accumulation. Debt to GDP is no longer on a term. Any growth dividend from investment is uncertain and baked into the numbers. Carney's increase in deficit spending puts upward pressures on net debt in the short to medium term, causing the federal debt to GDP ratio to rise slightly, stabilize higher than previously forecasted. However, the all levels net debt to GDP remains very low by international standards. And the budget capital focus plus efficiency measures are designed to prevent a sharp deterioration. Whether the ratio improves, stays stable, or rises further will depend on actual GDP growth from the investments and external factors. So we don't know if his plan will work. Focusing more on investment spending, which is the better type of spending because it gives you assets that you've invested into, which can be written off in the net debt to GDP ratio. Or whether the assets are worth more than the money they're putting in or less than the money, kind of affects which way the net debt to GDP